Okay, welcome back everybody, and welcome back to those of you watching on Zoom. We're moving now into the third session of today's seminar, which will take us into Franklin Roosevelt's important role in the Second World War. Before we go back to Gerhard, however, I want to thank all of the donors who helped to sustain CPH programs. The names are included. These are the people who gave over the last 12 months up between July 2022 and the end of June 2023. Thank you, everybody. A number of people in this room are on that list. I also want to express my appreciation to our partner organizations, which include the Merca Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley, which particularly supports Carolina K-12, the North Caroliniana Society, which underwrites many of our Carolina K-12 programs, and the General Alumni Association, Carolina Alumni, which partner with us on many of our programs. And I mention this because private support sustains our outreach, our programs, our support for faculty. And if you would like to be on this list, it's always possible to get on the list. All you have to do is send in a little gift. There's actually a little envelope in your packet, but it's easy to do online as well. I can't tell you how much it means to us to have a whole community of people. You know, they say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a community to support Carolina Public Humanities, and especially our outreach and support to faculty and people around the state. Finally, I want to thank the members of our extraordinary advisory board who continue to provide essential support, encouragement, advice. A few of those people are with us today. I think Margaret Avery is here in the room. Miriam Zetlow is here, yes. I think Paul Connick may be on the Zoom. We have some other people who've been essential contributors in the past. Shane Gadd is here, John Henley, Jerry Everhart, and the aforementioned Abby Allen, who is now a PhD 75 times over. So thanks to all of you on this board also for your support. I like to think of you sort of like Franklin Roosevelt's famous kitchen cabinet. You know that? He used to say, who's going to help us? Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters. No, not Ghostbusters. Anyway, there are a lot of ghosts out there, but we depend on this wonderful community of people. And mentioning Franklin Roosevelt and the kitchen cabinet leads me to our final subject. Gerhard Weinberg will now discuss Roosevelt and the American War. And I want to stress how much we appreciate Gerhard being here. He told us at lunch he has given up taking international trips to places like Estonia and Germany, but he still travels to Carolina Public Humanities. And we are very grateful for his being here. Thank you. 95 years old and counting. Gerhard Weinberg.
When we consider Roosevelt's role in the Second World War, running the American part of the effort, we have to keep in mind that his experience of World War I was enormously important and influential. People forget that he'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the First World War. And then, in the crucial 1920 election, he was the Democratic Party's candidate for Vice President of the United States. He had been all over the United States. The defeat of his party and his position in the 1920 election was of enormous subsequent importance to him. It was at that time that the American people decided to get out of Europe, not to join the League of Nations, not to ratify the peace treaties, we were going to get off a planet of where we were on our own planet. The rest of it had nothing to do with us, and we would have nothing to do with it. The assumption was that if we got off the earth, it would not turn without Washington's permission. Certainly the new President Harding and his successors Coolidge and Hoover shared that view. And their only major accomplishment, of course, was to bring on the Great Depression. Now, what one needs to also keep in mind is that not only was Hitler leading a Germany against which the United States had been obliged to fight in the First World War, but Italy and Japan had both been on the Allied side in the First World War. And that combination of things I will come back to when I get to Roosevelt's choice of Truman as his vice presidential running mate in 1944. When the war in Europe starts with the German invasion of Poland, Roosevelt is quite clear in his own mind that we should stay out but help the British and French. And he has a rough time getting the Congress to amend the various neutrality rules and make it possible first for the British and French to purchase weapons and other military equipment in the United States. And eventually, in the spring of '41, is able to persuade the Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. But at the same time as this is going forward with some aid to Britain and France across the Atlantic, we're worried about the Pacific. But in Roosevelt's view, Germany was the most dangerous. We, the United States, at British request, in fact, traded a whole bunch of essentially retired American destroyers to the British in exchange for leases on British colonies and bases in the Western Hemisphere. And the reason that the British were so eager to get these destroyers was the fight against German submarines in the Atlantic. And this is also where the issues of how the United States would handle that, as it had in the First World War, was a critical issue. After the Germans attack the Soviet Union, Roosevelt manages to get agreement that the Lend-Lease Act, which gave him a considerable amount of leeway as to who was eligible for us to get that, would be applied to the Soviet Union. To pursue aid to Britain across the North Atlantic in the face of German submarines, arrangements were made with the Danish government in exile for us to have bases in Greenland and also on Iceland, so that the whole North Atlantic situation would be better. Now, I want to get into how we got into the war actively. I mentioned in my last lecture the enormous importance of Germany's defeat in the Battle of Britain. Hitler realized that this was a defeat, and one of the ways he thought he could get further was to get the Japanese to attack the British Empire, seize Burma, India, the Dutch East Indies, British islands in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, anything else. And that would so weaken the Brits that Germany could crush them. The Japanese told Hitler in response to this request in 1940 that we want all those things and we plan to do it in 1945. The Germans realized immediately that the Japanese had not picked this date out by throwing a dart at a calendar, but because they knew that the American Congress had agreed to independence for the Philippines in 1944. The Japanese, in other words, wanted to take British, French, and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia, but they wanted to do it after the US had gotten out of the Philippines. Since Hitler was planning to go to war with the United States at some time anyway, he told the Japanese, go ahead now, don't wait. We will be in the war with the United States with you as soon as you strike the United States. You don't have to wait till 1945, and who knows how much the building up of American, especially naval forces, in the interim would make it difficult for you in the future. What you have thereafter is, in effect, a race between Hitler and Roosevelt. Hitler keeps pushing the Japanese, go, go, and we'll be with you immediately. But Roosevelt is talking with the Japanese, is working on negotiations with them, devoting an enormous amount of time to this, to stall them off. This race goes on from the fall of 40 into late 41. And because Mussolini, I might add, has joined Hitler in the same promise to Japan, and the Japanese government knew that Hitler and Mussolini don't always keep their word. So before they were going to strike, finally, they checked again with both the Germans and the Italian governments. Is your commitment still good? And both Hitler and Mussolini said yes. Hitler won this race by 1 week. If the Japanese had waited, after waiting a year, 1 more week, they would have seen the German defeat before Moscow and the Italian defeat in North Africa, and not been as certain as they were that Germany would win the war. They probably wouldn't have gone at it. But they were confident and went, and so the attack on Pearl Harbor meant not only that the United States responded by declaring war on Japan, but Hitler, who had been restraining the German Navy, which wanted to sink as many American ships as possible even before they were at war with the United States, has a tactical problem. Because of the crisis on the Eastern Front, he's not in Berlin. He's at his military headquarters in East Prussia at Rastenburg. So he tells Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy, well, you can start sinking anything and everything that's American. He goes back to Berlin, and they go through the formal procedure of declaring war on the United States on December 11th. And the United States then responds, and we're at war. But one needs to remember that during this subsequent war, Roosevelt always stuck to the notion of Europe first, and then we'll take care of the Japanese. Ironically, the isolationists and other domestic opponents of Hitler, of Roosevelt, always argued that we should concentrate on the Pacific first. In August, as I've already told you, Roosevelt had met with Churchill and they discussed various things. And in December, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill comes to Washington to discuss these various things. And he is relieved to discover that Roosevelt is sticking to his commitment and belief and policy that the war against Europe must have precedence over the war against Japan. Now, as you probably know, the war in 1942 in the Pacific is a series of disasters for the United States, but things begin to turn. In May of 42, the Japanese effort to take New Guinea as a part of taking Australia is halted at the Battle of the Coral Sea. And in June of 42, the next month, their effort to get Midway and Hawaii, the island of Midway at Hawaii, is defeated by the American Navy in the Battle of Midway. At the same time, the Japanese are advancing very rapidly in the Pacific, as they had planned and hoped. They conquer this whole area. And there is an interesting point here. Singapore, the British base, bottom of Malaya, the British force there surrenders in February of 42 already. Ironically, the number of British prisoners is roughly twice the number of Japanese forces. The Americans have been fighting with help of Filipinos in the Philippines, and at Corregidor, the last major military surrender is in May of 42 against overwhelming Japanese force. But the American leadership sticks to its beliefs and preferences in agreement with Roosevelt. On the 1st of April, 1942, Roosevelt, Stimson, his Secretary of War, General Marshall, his Chief of Staff, the Army Staff, both individuals whom Roosevelt had picked, I should point out, agree that there must be, to defeat Germany, a cross-channel invasion of France, of Western Europe. Churchill immediately says no, and interestingly enough, Roosevelt then decides to get the Russians to put some pressure on, and Soviet Foreign Commissar Molotov makes a trip then in May of 42 to London and to Washington, pushing for what Stalin calls a second front, an invasion of Western Europe. But Churchill doesn't change his mind. And as things evolve, if there's anything to be done, as I've already mentioned, it's going to be this invasion of Vichy French Northwest Africa. And in early November of 42, there is the joint British-American Operation Torch, the landings of American and British troops in Northwest Africa. There are lots of domestic issues in the United States in 42, but there's only one that it seems to me we will take time to review, and that is that in October of 39, Einstein, the scientist, had warned Roosevelt about the Germans beginning to develop atomic bombs. Roosevelt had immediately thereafter begun to push American scientific and engineering development in this direction, but in 1942, that the United States, hopefully, will be atomic weapons before the Germans. Now, I have already mentioned that when the British and Americans land in Northwest Africa, the Torch operation, the Germans and Italians pour troops into Tunisia. The fighting in Northwest Africa will continue from November of 42 to May of 43. To get the French to change their position, hopefully, or at least some of the troops, Eisenhower, who has been put in charge of this whole operation, makes a deal with a high Vichy French Admiral Darlan, who happens to be in North Africa because his son's in a hospital there. And he gets Darlan to switch sides from being, along with Pétain, the head of the Vichy government, aligned with Germany. He's going to be aligned with the Americans and Brits, and tells the French troops in Northwest Africa to switch sides. Now, you will understand that both within France and in the Vichy government, there is a lot of noise over this. But it is only fair to comment that in the United States and Great Britain, there's a lot of public uproar about a deal with a man who had been on the other side. But I think it is fair to say that in this case, as in a number of other over the years, Roosevelt sticks with his local military commander, whom, after all, he had picked for the job, and that was Eisenhower. In January of 43, while this fighting is in progress, the Allied leaders meet in Casablanca. Stalin is invited, but he won't come. He's not going to leave the Soviet Union any substantial distance. But at this meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and their top military advisors, they decide that when they get through, the next thing, at Churchill's insistence, cannot immediately be Normandy, that is cross-channel, but should be Sicily. And as I have mentioned, that's what will happen in July of 43, 2 months after the surrender of German and Italian forces in Tunisia. It is also at this time, at the Casablanca Conference in January 43, that Churchill and Roosevelt agree that this time the Germans are not and their allies are not going to get armistices. Since the Germans always pretended they really hadn't lost the First World War, we're going to make sure they lose the next one. And it is at this time that they arrange for public announcement that the Axis powers must surrender unconditionally. The other issue discussed there, but they can't solve it, is the whole question of the future of Poland. A discussion which gets more difficult when they learn about the Soviets killing these thousands of Polish officers at Katyn. The debate over that issue continues. Now, there is an issue that I think is touched on briefly but needs to be mentioned. And that is the situation in China. The Chinese are fighting against the Japanese since 1937. And that war is affected by the Japanese advance into Burma, from which over the Burma Road, supplies have been provided to the Chinese. And the whole issue of China keeping the Japanese busy is of central importance to the American leadership. Roosevelt has the American Congress end the extraterritorial rights that decades before the United States had acquired in China. We want to give Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese nationalists, something good about these new allies, because it is, in the eyes of at least some Chinese, weird that we're fighting alongside people who think they're so inferior that we can't try any of them if they commit a crime. And of course, he knows and has no objection to the fact that after the United States gets the Philippines back, they'll be independent. And of course, that leads to discussion about the independence, real or not, of the colonies of the Brits, of the French, and of the Dutch. As I have already mentioned, as a follow-up to the North African campaign in Tunisia, in July of '43, American and British troops land on Sicily, and there is no question, as I also mentioned, that this has an effect on the Eastern Front, because German troops fighting in Sicily and thereafter in Italy cannot simultaneously fight on the Eastern Front. It may not be the second front that Stalin wants, but it's at least a start. In August of '43, the Americans and Brits meet again, this time in Quebec, in Canada, and agree on continuing from Sicily into mainland Italy, something they end up doing the next month in September. And they insist on continuing the fight in Italy. In November, Churchill and Roosevelt, on the way to meeting Stalin in Tehran, a meeting I've already mentioned, meet in Cairo with Chiang Kai-shek and discuss with him the future of operations in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. They then, that is Churchill and Roosevelt, go from Cairo to Tehran, you understand? And there, the whole issue, if you will, of a cross-channel invasion overlord is affirmed to Stalin, whether Churchill wants it or not, but Roosevelt is insistent. And as a way of, I think, of getting some kind of reassurance, Stalin asks Roosevelt, well, who's going to command this big operation? And Roosevelt hasn't yet decided. And Stalin says, you know, a big operation without a commander ain't gonna go. And it is after the Tehran conference that Roosevelt decides that not George Marshall, who expected, I think, to be appointed the Army Chief of Staff, but Eisenhower will command. And if you ask why, I think this rather important decision, there are two factors in it. One of them is that Eisenhower, in his commanding in Northwest Africa, seems to manage reasonably well. He gets along with the British military commanders, with the Free French of de Gaulle, a considerable accomplishment, and the deal with Stalin, however politically harmful it had been, is simply not going to prevent him from appointing Eisenhower rather than Marshall as the commander of the American forces in Overlord, which after some other changes is the name of the new planned cross-channel invasion. As those plans go forward, there are a couple of issues that are important for Roosevelt and need to be mentioned. One of them is that there is to be a new international organization of states. The League of Nations has evaporated. The United States had refused to join it. And now there is going to be another after the war to keep this sort of disaster from occurring every 25 years. And Roosevelt gives very considerable time to pushing this. And the preparations and inaugural conferences for it, please note, take place in the United States. Bretton Woods, not far from Washington. In California, the things happen, and as will not come as an enormous surprise to you, the seat of the United Nations is going to be geographically in the United States, not in Switzerland, not anywhere else. It's going to be right here. And Roosevelt is pushing these things very much in part his reaction to what happened after the First World War. He does not want that to happen again. And what I think is important is that the other issue that comes to Roosevelt at this time, which takes up his thinking, is what we today call the Holocaust, the systematic killing of Jews by the Germans, which had begun I'm talking about killing, not just persecution, which had begun systematically in the summer of 1941 and is in the millions by 1942 and 3. The American immigration laws make things very difficult, but Roosevelt establishes a war refugee board, which is to try to find ways to help people escape systematic killing. And because Arabs in the area called Palestine are opposed to additional Jewish immigration, to Jews who've been there since either 1800 or 1500 before the Common Era begins, in other words, roughly 3,100 years before the first Arab moved to Palestine. He has a personal conversation with the king of Saudi Arabia. He's trying to get things worked out somehow. There's no need for us here to go into all the details of this. My point here is from Roosevelt's perspective. This is an issue of a British-controlled territory as a result of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. And the question is, who can immigrate into it? And are there any ways to move around the American immigration laws, at least to leave some into this country? What Neville Chamberlain had done back in 1938 after the German anti-Jewish riots of November 1938, an effort had been made to do that here in the United States, but the Congress wouldn't do it. So this is an issue that remains. As in, we're talking now 44, D-Day approaches, Churchill, after finally agreeing, does try to cancel the landing on the south coast of France, because that meant, obviously, moving divisions of troops from the Italian front, which is Churchill's favorite. But Roosevelt insists. And although it's delayed some into August of 44, it, as you probably know, goes forward and is successful. And eventually, after the success of the D-Day landing and the Allied troops grinding their way forward, and at the end of June, beginning of July, breaking out, they then eventually meet the Allied force that has landed on the Mediterranean coast of France. And there is, again, a real, what I think we could call Western Front. And it works. He has to, in the same time, Roosevelt has to be concerned about the Pacific War. And in July of 44, he personally goes, or is carried, obviously, to Hawaii and meets the new commanders there whom he has appointed. That is to say, the commander in Hawaii in the Pacific there has been fired because of the disaster in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. And Nimitz is now the commander there. And MacArthur, who after his turn as Army Chief of Staff had been shipped off to the Philippines, is still in the Pacific. And so now you have the arrangement made in the summer of 44 that Nimitz will control the American Navy and other forces in the central and main part of the Pacific, and MacArthur will, in the southwest Pacific, return to the Philippines, and then the bases that will be acquired by the American, what was called island hopping in the first Southwest and then Central Pacific, meet with MacArthur's push up in the Southwest Pacific. That will then provide the bases for first the bombing and then the landing on Japan, because it is pretty clear to those involved at the time I'm talking about that as Allied forces are going to have to occupy Germany from east and west, and possibly also from the south, that is from Italy, the Japanese are not going to give up because some island most Japanese have never heard of has been first conquered by them and then reconquered by the Allies. But the country will have to be invaded. In 1944, the year that I am now talking about, Roosevelt, who had been elected to a completely unprecedented third term in 1940, is going to run for a fourth term. And the issue is, who will be his vice president at a time when it is obvious to most around the president that he's not only elderly, but he's not well. So that whoever is picked as his vice presidential candidate in the 1944 election is most likely to be his successor as well as his vice president. There are arguments about various people, but the decision in this is made by Roosevelt himself. Wallace, who had been his vice president, is dropped, and he picks Harry Truman, who at the time we're talking about is in the U.S. Senate from the state of Missouri, that is his home state. During the war, up to this time, Truman, in addition to whatever else he's been doing in the Senate on legislation and so on, has been in charge of a committee which produced quite a bit of publicity for him, which was looking into the proper working of government agencies and industry in support of the war effort. From the perspective of the political side of all this, you see, this was a very good way, from Roosevelt's point of view, for this man who, nobody knew much of anything about, the publicity that he'd had was to make the war go better for the United States by doing well at home. That the main thing that in fact drew, if you will, Roosevelt to Truman was the fact that Truman was a World War I veteran. He had been an artillery officer on the Western Front. Roosevelt, in this, is thinking of the future, which is to be different from the future that had developed in the last part of his role, his own role in the First World War. He wants to be sure that if, hopefully, his successor does a good job and continues to get elected, the American people will support the notion of the earth being round and we on it, as opposed to what had happened in 1920. And it is one of those things that the American people in the 1944 election pick Roosevelt and Truman. The notion that the earth is round is much more in the eye of the American people than it had been before. Let me give you a couple of examples. The longest battle in American history was the battle for Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands from early August of 42 to February 43. American soldiers, first Marines and then Marines and Army, and of course Air Force and Navy, are fighting on Guadalcanal. That's about as far away from the United States as you can imagine. There is another aspect of this that makes publicity at the time, but is worth noting. As you know, there is this campaign in Italy. Obviously, it comes up here. And in Yugoslavia, the communist leader, Tito, has been running a resistance against the German and Italian occupiers, and wants and hopes to expand Yugoslavia at the expense of Austria and Italy. There is, therefore, at the end of that campaign in 45, a contest for Trieste, the main port up here. The unit under the Allied command in Italy that saves Trieste for Italy is a division from New Zealand. I have a sneaking suspicion that when those New Zealand soldiers rode home, their family hadn't the foggiest notion where on earth they were, huh? And the number of people in Trieste who knew or cared about New Zealand cannot have been very large. This event, which gets publicity at the time, of course, not only in Europe and New Zealand, but in the United States, is another way in which people learn that the earth is indeed round, and that things in one part of it affect another. And so when Truman becomes president in April of 1945, because Roosevelt has died, he also, please remember, wins election again, Truman, in 48. Excuse me. The American public has been, if you will, reoriented by Roosevelt quite deliberately and quite consciously to have things different this time from what he considered both the personal, political, and the national disasters at the end of World War I. One of the major post-war developments that you will find discussed in American history books is called the Truman Doctrine. And then the Marshall Plan. One was Roosevelt's pick as his vice president, and the other was Roosevelt's pick as commander-in-chief of the army. Whether one agrees with any of this or not, that's not my point. My point as a historian is that this issue, which was so important to Roosevelt, and that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk as important, he actually did get the American people to change their views. And it is worth noting that the other political party from Roosevelt's picks as its candidate and two-time president Dwight Eisenhower, who had been Roosevelt's choice for a high command in Africa and in Europe. And nobody had to tell Eisenhower that the earth is round. He had been personally in command in the African and European theater. So that aspect, I think, of Roosevelt's concern and leadership worked out so that the United States, after World War II, wisely or unwisely, everybody is entitled to their own opinion of this, but the country reacts and operates fundamentally differently after World War II from the way it had operated after World War I. In that regard, he was certainly successful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I wanted to mention before you leave to fill out the evaluation form that's in your packet. I meant to mention that earlier, but we appreciate your perspectives and your advice on that. Thank you very much. That was an encouraging view of Roosevelt's historical impact. If you think about his impact on America from 1932 all the way to 1960, when you put Eisenhower in there, that's a really interesting linkage. Okay, we're open for comments or questions, and also, as usual, if you're online, you can drop a question into the Q&A. You want me to? I have been delegated by my friend and colleague, Brent, to ask this question. Of all the political leaders or military leaders in World War II, one, who was the most interesting person? And number two, who is your favorite person? Those could be the same, but they could be different. Who do you find most interesting of the leaders during World War II? And who is your favorite?
Well, in some ways, Roosevelt is most interesting and favorite, but it's very difficult to comment. The interest of Stalin and Churchill is very, very high to me. And I must admit, for this period, I'm also very interested in some people on the other side. Roosevelt, Hitler in particular, and a number of those under or next to Hitler. But I think that's all I can really say.
I think you gave a very strong affirmation of Roosevelt's significance in your last comments and what he did to reshape the world and leave a legacy, which actually you could say even continued beyond Eisenhower in some ways, as NATO and maybe all the way down to the recent past. Other comments or questions about Roosevelt or anything else you'd like to hear Gerhard's wisdom about?
With respect to the immigration policies.
In respect to what?
The immigration policy.
Oh, yes.
I assume that Mrs. Roosevelt had some influence on her husband in this regard. Would you comment on that? And were there others in the administration who were instrumental in moving President Roosevelt on that issue?
Mrs. Roosevelt was very influential both in pushing the president from time to time on issues, but she was also very effectively active in his election campaigns and in policy debates in the United States. And on the immigration issue and on the racial discrimination within the United States issue, Eleanor Roosevelt pushed and generally pushed carefully and had at least some impact on the president, and also some impact on American public opinion, because she was a very good speaker and traveled the country making speeches on political subjects, as very few wives of presidents have done.
So on that issue, two issues that have attracted a lot of attention in recent years. One was Roosevelt's view of the confinement of Japanese Americans in the camps during the war. and the other is his relation to Philip Randolph and the African American workers during the war. Was Roosevelt moving toward a more tolerant view of how internal domestic politics should work during the war? Did he evolve on that, or was he pretty consistent throughout? What about those two issues?
Yes, I think, excuse me, pushed on these, and she had to push both the public and her husband, and did. And she continued, I should add, to do this after he died. She was the official American representative in the new United Nations organization. And she traveled around the country speaking. That's the one time I met her, when she came to the college which I was then attending in Albany, New York, and which was involved in a multi-college program for equal rights for blacks. And she came to a meeting there and was helping and pushing and publicizing those efforts.
Okay, thank you. We have another question back here. Yeah.
I've always wondered, for all our military might, how did we let Japan attack Pearl Harbor? And there were even German subs in the Mississippi River. I mean, how come we weren't better protected?
So the question is, how did we allow the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor? Why weren't we better protected? And how was it possible for German subs to come so close? They were in the Mississippi. They were certainly along the coast of North Carolina.
Okay. The answer to the first is that the Japanese approached quietly, and our commanders who were fired afterwards were not scouting enough and carefully enough, so that when they came in, it was a surprise. And when the Americans at the northern end of Oahu, American soldiers, low-ranking corporals or PFCs, saw and heard, and warned, they were assured these would be Americans that were being transferred to the Philippines. The other question was, the other part?
How did the Americans allow the Germans to come so close to the United States? Submarines all along the coast?
Well, it wasn't something that we gave them permits for. We did not have the preparation for anti-submarine warfare that we needed. And Admiral King had not pushed enough, I think, to get our anti-submarine activities going. It's always been my opinion that one of the big mistakes that Roosevelt made was that when the German operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat, started, that is to say, when in January and February of '42, German submarines were torpedoing ships off the coast, he did not insist, perhaps by personally traveling up and down the East Coast, that buildings be darkened. The German submarines would come up at night, see the ships that were going very carefully outlined against the lights of hotels, skyscrapers, and whatnot, and torpedo them. And it is not until the summer of '42 that serious efforts are made in this direction, that is, blacking out the coast. It was Admiral King, the head of the American Navy, who ought to have ordered for convoys and other protective measures much earlier. than he did. And so in those months of early 1942, there was unbelievable shipping loss off. And ironically, nowadays, in North Carolina, the state in which I live and taught for many years, in North Carolina, one of the tourist sites are the shipwrecks off the coast, because that's where the German operation was especially successful, because of the geographical factors involved, Cape Hatteras and so on, where there was a great many ships were sunk by German submarines.
Everything can become a tourist attraction
Yeah.
eventually. Could I ask just maybe a final question? You have described Roosevelt's achievements. In your view, was Roosevelt the most important president in American history? Or put another way, among the most important American presidents, do you think Roosevelt was greater than Lincoln or Washington or anyone else? Was Roosevelt the most important?
Well, I wouldn't put him above these others that you mentioned, but he was certainly as important as any. And for obvious reasons of time, I have not gone into major aspects of Roosevelt's domestic policies, which were of enormous importance, both in bringing the United States out of the Great Depression, and in such issues as the development and protection of the national parks and national monuments, and such other.
So, it's interesting now, our country is so divided. You wonder if there were a crisis comparable, and then maybe there is, to what happened in World War II. Could the United States ever mobilize again as it did under Roosevelt? There's so much suspicion of government, of policies, of leaders. Could anybody do what Roosevelt did in the 21st century? This is the kind of question that historians hate, because it's like, what do you think will happen next? But nobody in this room has seen more than you have, so I'm looking for a glimmer of hope. Could we ever do again what Roosevelt managed to do in the 30s and 40s, to reestablish forward-looking unity? And there was never unity, but comparative to what's happened now.
It's always possible, but I don't see the current situation as moving in that direction.
I take it from a man who's seen it all, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, it is interesting, too, with the current debate about Biden, who's going to be the vice president? Is he too old? This was very much a part of the debate in 1944 also, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is why we need history. No matter what happens to us, something else has already happened to other people to give us perspective. I think we're going to come to an end here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all that Gerhard Weinberg brings to Carolina Public Humanities, to our community. I want to thank you. Thank you. And again, I thank all of you who joined us on Zoom. I thank all of you in the room. I thank Beth Gardner, Paul Bonici, and all of you. Keep dry and forward. Go Heels. I guess I should say that. I forgot that. That's the other side of the university. Thank you, Gerhard.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.